In this lecture, we'll introduce the basic concept of neural networks. We have already covered some regression and classification models, and neural network can be used for both classification and regression tasks based on how you actually construct your neural network. If we trace back, the first neural network was developed or researched by Frank Rosenblatt in 1957. What we call it as a perceptron. Okay, so here we have a picture of a biological neuron. As a living organism, human has one of the most complex nervous system, and we take input from the outside world through some cells, what you call dendrite. Okay, and this neuron is very complex cell architecture. The concept of neural network was first developed by simulating how this neuron works. Okay, I will take the example of a logistic regression model and slowly connect you guys to the concept of neural network. Okay, if you recall, this is our standard logistic regressor classifier. So we are using this sigmoid function, and based on the output and a threshold 0.5, we can identify whether an input X is either in class 0 or 1. Okay, so we have talked about this classifier in another lecture, but we will use this construct to connect to the idea of neural network. We have represented the same function here using some diagrams. Here we have a two-step process. So your input feature is X. G is actually a linear combination of your input X corresponding parameter W1 and bias term W0. So if you recall, this is a kind of linear regression format. And in the second step, if I pass this G to a logistic function, then the output will be either 0, 1, 1 based on the basic working principle of logistic regression. So you can think it as your first neural network that will output 0 or 1 based on what you input as X. Okay. So in neural network terminology, we call these two steps together into one construct, what we call a node. Okay. A neural network node performs a two-step process. The first one is aggregation, and then the second one, what we call an activation operation, just like here. So this is aggregation, and the second step is an activation function. And for logistic regression, we call this activation function a sigmoid function. Okay. So in neural network terminology, we are calling this as a node, but you need to remember each node follows two sequential steps. One is aggregation, and then the second is activation. If you encounter this kind of diagram of a neural network, you need to quickly connect that this Y is coming through a two-step process, linear aggregation, and then an activation operation or activation function. Okay. In neural network literature, you will encounter different activation functions. For example, identity activation function, binary step function, logistic function that we have just explained, then hyperbolic tangent activation function, ReLU or rectified linear unit activation function. So as soon as you learn that what activation function was used, you can quickly connect that they are talking about the second step that differentiate with different neural network configurations. Okay. And another thing is your output will be based on what activation function you use. So if you use a logistic activation function, then your output will be a real valued function. Okay. If you use an identity function, your G will be your Y. Okay. People have used ReLU activation function a lot. So if you read through, you are saying that if the value is actually negative, then the value is 0, otherwise Y. Y is actually a copy of G. Okay. So that's how we read the ReLU activation function. Okay. So here again, the neural network node is actually a two-step process, linear aggregation and activation. And I hope that you have understood what is the role of an activation function, and how a neural network actually is different between constructs based on like what activation function you use. Okay. So if we understood correctly, so far this is our first neural network, and the output of this neural network is dependent on the activation function, So this part is common, but the output will really depend on what value you want as your output, right? If we take this as our first neural network, we are calling this as our output layer and this as our input layer. Okay, so we have input layer and output layer, but no hidden layer. Okay, and this is the construct that Frank Rosenblatt used to train his perceptron. Okay, the main advantage of neural network you will get by applying hidden layers. So you have output layer and then input layer, but you can create as many layers as you want, and you can put as many nodes as you want in each hidden layer. This gave us the flexibility of adding more and more nonlinearity in our model. Okay, so this is a construct with one output layer, one input layer, and one hidden layer. But as I said, that you have flexibility in this region to create more complex neural networks. Okay. One more thing, there are many kinds of neural network that we will be learning, but here we are talking about one specific neural network, which we call it as feed-forward neural network. So if you pay attention, you can see that there is no connection within layers. The connections are only at the forward direction. So each layer is connecting to the next layer. Okay. Another property is, if you have noticed, each node is actually connected to all previous nodes by this forward direction, right? That's why we call this as a feed-forward, fully connected neural network. Okay. Now we'll move to a more complex construct. Here you have 4 input features from x1 to x4 represented as vector x. So this is your input layer, and here is the construct of your first hidden layer. Okay, so if you follow, you have 2 hidden nodes in your first hidden layer. Let's look some of the notational convention. As you have 4 inputs and 2 hidden nodes, you will have 4 times 2 model parameter represented through these arrows, and you also have a bias term. So how many parameters up to now we have? So it's 4 plus 1 times 2. Okay, so we will have 10 arrows connecting the input layer to the first hidden layer. So these 10 model parameters are represented through 2 vectors, or W, you can think it as a matrix. So this is of size 8 and your bias has 2 parameters. So that leads to 8 plus 10 parameters up to now. Okay. Now our second hidden layer, and again this second hidden layer has 2 nodes, and if you estimate the parameters, you will find that here this W2 matrix has 2 times 2 parameters, and this bias vector will have 2 additional parameters. Okay, so you see like how this construct is actually moving forward. Okay, and then the second layer will have their corresponding activation function, and then you have your final layer, that is the output layer. So these are your model parameters, and if you notice, we are using some subscript to actually denote the parameters of that corresponding layer. Okay, so these are the parameter vectors of the first to the second layer, then these are from the second to the third layer, and this is your final layer parameters. Okay, so now you will see these kind of constructs, but we can clearly read through. So for example, here we are telling that the input to the third layer is the parameters from the previous layer, and then the activation outputs plus their biases. Okay, so now you have a clear idea about how a more complex feed-forward neural network looks like and what are their parameters. Okay, thank you.